The flatbed arrived on a Wednesday morning with no warning and a driver who barely made eye contact. Calvin Brent heard the air brakes from the far end of the garage, where he was elbow deep in a carburetor rebuild for '68 Mustang belonging to a retired schoolteacher named Doris, who called every third day to check on her progress and had been calling every third day for 6 weeks. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and walked out into the gray November light. The truck was commercial grade, the kind that didn't typically find its way down the 2-lane running through Dellwood. No company name on the side, just a plain white cab and a flatbed loaded with 5 steel shipping frames, each one bolted under a heavy tarp. "Brent Garage?" the driver called, not looking up from his clipboard. "That's the sign," Calvin said. It took most of an hour to unload all 5. The driver handed over an envelope along with the paperwork and was back in his cab before Calvin had finished reading past the first paragraph. He stood in the gravel lot and read it twice. Property disposal, Harwick Automotive Group. Recipient, Brent Garage, Dellwood, Ohio. Contents, 5 prototype chassis frames. Criterion Series experimental build. Condition, structurally compromised, non-viable. Disposal classification, commercial discard. He folded the paper. He didn't move for a moment. Harwick Automotive Group. He hadn't said those words out loud in 5 years. He'd seen the name occasionally, on a trade magazine at the dentist's office, on the side of a hauler passing through on the state road, and each time he'd felt it the way you feel an old injury in cold weather. Not sharp, just present. He walked to the first frame and crouched beside it. It was in bad shape. One side rail had a stress fracture running nearly clean through. The cross-member bracing had been partially cut, not from any mechanical failure, but from something deliberate, something done in a hurry and a particular kind of anger. The welds were surface corroded in places, but structurally intact, and that was the thing that stopped him. Those welds were his. Not generically his, personally his. He developed a finishing technique during his second year at Harwick, a 3-pass overlap on load-bearing joints that left a specific visual signature, a small herringbone ridge at the terminal edge that no standard weld gun produced. It was habit, not a marking. Just something his hands did, the same way some people doodle without noticing. He pressed his thumb along the inner seam of the frame rail and felt the ridge. Then he found it again on the second frame, and the third. 5 chassis frames, 5 sets of his hand's fingerprints, built into the steel. He stood up slowly, looked at all 5 frames lined up in his gravel lot, and felt something move through him that had no clean name. Not anger yet, something older than anger. Recognition. Calvin Brent was 42 years old and did not look like someone who had once led the engineering team on a $26 million development program. He looked like what he was now. A garage owner in a town of 6,000, with permanently darkened knuckles, a truck with a cracked dashboard he kept meaning to replace, and a daughter who was smarter than him in 3 specific areas and would shortly be smarter than him in all of them. Dellwood sat in the flat middle part of Ohio where winters came early, and the interstate passed 20 miles east without stopping. He'd ended up here the way people end up in places like this, not by choosing it exactly, but by choosing the thing that led to it. After everything fell apart in Columbus, he'd needed distance and quiet, and a place where his daughter Iris could walk to school. Dellwood had 2 of the 3. Iris walked to school. The quiet was real. Distance, he was learning, you carry with you. He'd bought the garage from a man named Hep Colton, who was 81 and tired and had kept the place running on goodwill and duct tape for longer than any building inspector would have approved. Calvin had fixed it properly. New lift, proper ventilation, electrical rewired to code, and spent the first 6 months wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake, and the following 4 years too busy to wonder much of anything. Iris came home from school at 3:15, which was 5 minutes later than usual. She was 13, dark-haired, and possessed of her mother's particular talent for saying the most necessary thing in the fewest possible words. She dropped her bag inside the door, stepped around the parts cart with the automatic ease of a person who had grown up navigating this specific obstacle, and appeared at his elbow. "There are weird frames in the lot," she said. "I know. They look like your kind of frames." He picked up his wrench. "Go start your homework." "I did it on the bus." "Do it again." "Dad." He looked at her. She was watching him the way she'd watched him for 5 years, since she was 8 and old enough to understand that certain silences in her father meant something more than quiet. She had her mother's eyes, brown, steady, always looking for the real version of what you'd said. "They're from my old job," he said. She nodded once, as if that was exactly the answer she'd been waiting for. Then she grabbed a granola bar from the mini-fridge and went inside, calling back over her shoulder, "The Okafor lady called about her alternator. I told her Thursday." "Thursday's tight." "I told her Thursday," Iris repeated, and the door closed. Calvin stood alone in the garage with 5 chassis frames. From a program he'd spent 3 years building, and he stayed there until the light changed. The call came 11 days after the delivery on a Thursday morning from a Columbus area code. "Mr. Brent," a woman's voice, controlled, precise, with the particular quality of someone accustomed to directing conversations without being obvious about it. "My name is Dana Harwick. I'm chief executive of Harwick Automotive Group. I believe you received a disposal shipment from us recently." Calvin was standing in the kitchen with his coffee. "I did. I'll be traveling through your area at the end of next week. I'd like to stop in, inspect the disposal items, verify the documentation." "You want to check on your scrap," he said. A pause. "I want to verify the transfer. The documentation says commercial discard. Those frames were classified as structurally compromised and non-viable." He let that sit for a beat. "So you're coming to look at your garbage." Another pause, longer. He could hear the careful quality of someone deciding not to react the way they wanted to. "I'll be there Friday, 2 o'clock. "I'll be here," Calvin said, and set his phone down. He stood in the kitchen for a while, looking at nothing in particular. Then he went into the garage and started making a list of what the first frame needed. He had 12 days. He used all of them. Dana Harwick arrived at 1:48, 12 minutes early, in a car that cost more than Calvin's garage had grossed in 18 months. She was alone, which he hadn't expected. She stepped out and took in the property with a look Calvin had learned to recognize, not contempt, exactly, but recalibration. The modest sign. The older building, now clean and well-maintained. The gravel lot. The 5 frames stacked along the sidewall. She walked toward him, and he met her at the door. She was younger than he'd pictured. Early 30s, dark hair, an expression that was professional on the surface and working considerably harder underneath. "Mr. Brent," she said. "Miss Harwick," he said, and stepped aside. She came into the garage and stopped. She looked at the 5 frames on their stands the way you look at something when you're deciding how you feel about it before you show anyone your reaction. "You've done work on them," she said. "Damage assessments. I haven't started restoration yet." He walked toward the nearest frame. "But I'll show you what I found, if that's what you came for." She followed. He showed her everything. The stress fractures consistent with impact damage rather than structural failure in the original build. She smiled at the crossmember cuts that hadn't come from any testing protocol. They came from someone with a grinder in about 20 minutes and a reason to want these frames looking worse than they were. The welds, intact and sound, running along load paths that matched exactly the performance tolerances the Criterion program had been designed to achieve. Dana said nothing through most of it. She stood with her arms folded and listened to him talk in the quick, specific vocabulary of someone who'd lived with these technical details for 3 years and hadn't been able to stop thinking about them in the 5 years since. "Whoever told you these frames failed structural testing," Calvin said at the end, "wasn't giving you the full picture." She held his gaze. "What picture were they giving me?" "Come back when I've finished the first frame," he said. 2 weeks. I'll show you what it actually is." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, carefully, the way careful people nod when they've committed to something they can't yet fully evaluate. 2 weeks, she said. She left at 2:24. Calvin stood in the empty garage and listened to her car pull off the gravel and get smaller in the distance. Then he picked up his tools and got back to it. Dana drove back to Columbus with the radio off, and her mind doing the thing it did when something wasn't adding up, running the same sequence repeatedly, looking for where the logic broke. She'd gone to Dellwood to spend 20 minutes on a routine disposal verification. Instead, she'd spent 39 minutes listening to a man in a worn shop jacket explain the structural engineering of chassis frames she'd personally signed off on discarding. Explain them with the intimate, specific knowledge of someone who had designed and built them. She'd asked where he'd learned this level of technical work. He'd deflected without being rude, the way people do when the answer is something they're not ready to share with someone they don't trust yet. She understood that instinct. She used it herself, several times a day. What she couldn't stop hearing was the thing he'd said at the end. Whoever told you these frames failed structural testing wasn't giving you the full picture. He'd said it the way you state a fact you've had years to make peace with. She pulled over at a rest stop and called her deputy, a methodical young man named Warren Toole, who had the valuable quality of not asking why. The complete Criterion series file, she said when he picked up. Every engineering report, every test result, every personnel record, every budget document, everything going back to the program's inception. That's a significant volume of material. Some of those records are in the archived. Monday morning, Warren, all of it. She pulled back onto the highway and drove the rest of the way in silence. The files arrived Monday in 2 boxes and a drive. Dana cleared her schedule and started from the beginning. By Tuesday evening, she had found 9 things that didn't add up. The Criterion program had run for 3 years and had been, on paper, a structural failure. 3 prototype builds that couldn't pass the company's own safety thresholds under test conditions. The official story, the one she'd inherited when she took over after her father died 14 months ago, was clean and simple. Ambitious program, insufficient results, terminated before further losses. The test results were in the file. Dana read the actual data, not the summary interpretation, the raw numbers, and found herself slowing down, then stopping, then reading specific sections 3 times. The frames hadn't failed. Not exactly. They'd failed a specific subset of parameters under a protocol that had been revised 6 weeks before the final tests were run. The revision had been filed as a routine procedural update. It had raised the minimum threshold requirements by a margin that made failure not just likely, but mathematically guaranteed given the existing builds. The change was authorized through a department under the direct oversight of Stafford Reeve, who had been the company's chief operating officer for 9 years, and who had, as far as Dana had known until this week, been one of her father's most trusted men. She looked at the personnel file for the Criterion program's lead engineer. The name had been removed from every document, not omitted, not misplaced, but administratively scrubbed. Every instance replaced with the notation, lead engineer, position terminated, reference restricted. She spent an hour in the archived regulatory system before finding a secondary filing that someone had missed during the scrub. A federal safety compliance certification maintained by an outside agency that still carried the original name. Calvin Brent, lead engineer, Criterion Series Development Program, Harwick Automotive Group. She set the paper down and looked at it for a long time. She'd driven to a garage in a small Ohio town to verify a disposal. She'd stood in that garage and watched a man explain structural engineering with the fluency of someone who designed the very structures he was describing. Because he had. It was past 11 when she called Warren Toole. In the morning, she said, I need everything we have on a former employee named Calvin Brent, and I need to know who authorized the removal of his name from the Criterion documentation. They met at a diner in Dellwood the following Tuesday at 8 in the morning. The place was called Patsy's, which it had been its name since 1991 and still appeared to be run by someone's grandmother, which Calvin had come to consider a mark in its favor. He was already in a booth when Dana arrived, and she accepted the coffee the waitress brought before she'd even taken her coat off, which told him she'd driven more than an hour to get here. You found something, he said. Several things, she said. Your name was removed from every internal record connected to the Criterion program. Engineering documents, patent applications, personnel files. Someone processed a formal administrative action to erase any trace that you had anything to do with that program. Calvin wrapped both hands around his mug. I know. She looked at him steadily. You know. I suspected the scope of it. I didn't have the internal access to confirm it. He paused. I found out it was happening about 3 months before my contract was terminated. By the time I understood the full extent, I'd already been gone a year and had run out of the money and energy to fight it any further. In the records I found, whose authorization runs through the trail. Stafford Reeve, Calvin said, not a question. Something shifted in her expression. His department, yes, through several administrative layers, but every thread runs back to his oversight. He told her about Reeve the way you describe a mechanism that failed. Precisely, without personal heat, though the personal heat was there underneath. Reeve had been smooth and procedural, and had worked within the company's administrative systems the way a skilled forger works within a currency's design, using the existing rules to accomplish something the rules existed to prevent. He'd praised Calvin's engineering in meetings and systematically diluted any record of it. He'd manufactured distance between Calvin and Calvin's access to the company's founder. He'd used the internal grievance process as a delay instrument, not a resolution one. When Calvin's wife Sandra was diagnosed, he'd applied for a medical hardship advance against his contract, a provision he was legally entitled to. Reeve's office had denied it through a procedural objection. The appeal had been deferred 4 months through successive administrative delays. Sandra had gone through 2 rounds of treatment by then, and Calvin had spent everything he had. He filed a formal complaint. 3 weeks later, he was called into a conference room and told his position was being restructured, his contract terminated, and that his separation agreement included a non-disclosure provision. He'd signed it. He'd had a sick wife and a daughter who was 8 years old and a bank account with less than 2 months left in it. She died 4 months after I left, Calvin said. He said it plainly, the way he'd learned to say it over 5 years of it being true. Whether different access to care would have changed the outcome, I don't know. I've had a long time to sit with that possibility. Dana was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, it came out without the professional coding that most of her words carried. I'm sorry, she said. Just that. Thank you, he said. She opened the folder she'd brought and slid a document across the table. There's something else. I found this in my father's private estate files. It was flagged for his attorney and never sent. Calvin read it. Warren Harwick's writing was direct, the prose of an engineer who had become an executive and never stopped thinking like the former. He had documented the test protocol revision and its implications. He had documented what he found in Calvin's personnel file and the administrative action that had erased his name. And he had documented the consulting arrangement Stafford Reeve held with an overseas drivetrain manufacturer. An arrangement that had never been disclosed to the board, whose value increased substantially when the Criterion program failed and the outside contract was extended. At the end, Warren Harwick had written, Calvin Brent built the finest structural engineering work this company has ever produced. What happened to him was not done with my knowledge or my approval, and it will not remain uncorrected. When this is set right, and it will be set right, his name will be restored in full to every record it was removed from. He deserved better from this company and from me personally. Calvin read the last paragraph twice. Then he closed the folder and set it on the table. He found out, Calvin said. Yes, Dana said. He tried to reach you 6 months after you left. He left a voicemail. Calvin looked at the table. I was in the hospital waiting room when I listened to it. Sandra was in surgery. He paused. I told myself I'd call him when things settled down. Things didn't settle down. The diner moved around them. Someone at the counter was complaining warmly and at length about the weather. A child at the next table was negotiating the terms of a pancake. He was heading toward correcting it, Calvin said. He just ran out of time. Yes, Dana said, and I'm going to finish what he started. She held his gaze. But not without knowing where you stand. Whatever I bring to the board, you have more stake in the outcome than anyone. I'm asking what you want done. Calvin thought about it. He thought about 5 frames in a gravel lot, and 3 years of his hands' work sitting inside them, and about the specific, deliberate timing of everything Reeve had done. The hardship denial, the manufactured termination, the patient scrubbing of a name, the calculation of someone who understood that the most effective damage is inflicted when people can least afford to push back. The company employs a lot of people, he said finally. None of them had anything to do with what Reeve did. Whatever comes out of this needs to target him specifically and protect the company's stability. He paused. Surgical, not scorched earth. That's harder to execute, she said. It's the right way, he said, and I want the record corrected. My name on the work I built, the patent applications corrected, the criterion program accurately represented in the company's history. He looked at her evenly, and the compensation that was withheld, not because I need it, but because it was contractually owed and withholding it was part of the fraud. The record should say so. It will, Dana said without hesitation. He nodded. Then let's finish the frames. They finished all 5 in 18 days. Calvin worked with the focus that comes from having waited a long time to be able to do the thing you're doing. Iris brought dinner to the garage on the final 3 evenings and did homework at the cleared workbench, and occasionally offered technical observations that were either completely wrong or exactly right, with no middle ground, which Calvin had come to understand was simply how she operated. On the last night, when he put his tools down and straightened up and looked at 5 frames standing in a row under the shop lights, all of them complete, all of them carrying the herringbone ridge of his hand's signature at every load-bearing joint. Iris appeared in the doorway in her socks, carrying 2 mugs of tea she'd made too strong the way she always made it. She climbed onto her stool and looked at the frames for a long moment. They look finished, she said. They are. Do you think they'll work the way you built them to work? He took the mug she offered. He looked at 5 years of being told the answer was no. Yeah, he said, I do. She accepted this with a nod, as if she'd expected exactly that answer, and went back to her homework. He stayed another hour, and then he went inside. The validation test was run at an independent facility 40 minutes north. Dana attended. The engineer who ran the structural protocol, a compact woman named Dr. Lena Shaw, with 30 years of testing behind her and the economy of words that produces, watched the data readouts for the first frame and was quiet for a long time before she said, Mr. Brent, these numbers are exceptional. Calvin stood very still in the center of the testing bay and felt something loosen in his chest that had been pulled tight for 5 years. All 5 frames passed every test in the protocol. Each one performed at or above the specification the falsified results had declared impossible. The 3 design modifications Calvin had made during the restoration, adjustments he'd wanted to implement in the original builds, and had never been given the time to complete, showed an average 19% improvement in torsional resistance over the original specification. Dana stood beside him during the readout and said nothing for a long time. Then she said quietly, My father was right about you. Your father was right about the program, Calvin said. I just built it. That's the same thing, she said. He didn't argue with her. He was too tired to argue, and he thought she might actually be right. The board meeting was on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks later, on the 17th floor of the Harwick Tower in Columbus. Dana presented the case with the flat, measured precision of someone who had spent those 3 weeks making every element bulletproof: the financial records, the undisclosed consulting arrangement, the falsified test protocol, the administrative scrubbing of Calvin's name, the full validation data from all 5 frames, and Warren Harwick's memo, which she set on the table without announcement and simply asked the board to read. Stafford Reeves sat at the table and managed his composure with the skill of a man who'd spent 9 years practicing it. He reframed. He questioned sources. He suggested the investigation exceeded the CEO's proper authority. He implied that Warren Harwick's document reflected the incomplete perspective of a man in declining health. He held his composure until the board members read the memo. Calvin watched Reeves' face during that reading from his chair along the wall. He saw the moment the man understood what he was looking at, something written by a dead man in the full clarity of his final months, based on evidence he'd spent that time methodically assembling. It couldn't be reframed. It couldn't be procedurally buried. It was just there, on the table, in front of 11 people with the authority to act on it. The composure didn't break, but it shifted, visibly, in a way Reeve couldn't fully prevent. The board voted 8-3 to suspend his executive authority, pending formal investigation. Both votes on Calvin's compensation and on the correction of his name in the record were unanimous. When the chair of the board, a precise woman named Patricia Oatley, announced the second result. She looked down the table toward Calvin and said, "The record should have reflected this from the beginning. It will now." Calvin nodded. He didn't trust his voice for anything more elaborate than that, which was fine. The room didn't require anything more from him. The room had already done the thing that needed doing. In the hallway afterward, Dana found him at the window looking out over the city. She came to stand beside him, not quite next to him, at the angle of someone who is present, but leaving him space. "How are you?" she said. "Still processing," he said, which was honest. The weight of it hadn't reorganized itself into anything recognizable yet. It was just a lot of feeling in a hallway 17 floors up. "The frames," she said. "The board voted to revive the Criterion program. I'd like your technical advisory going forward. Monthly remote your terms." "That works," he said. "I have a garage to run." She almost smiled. "I know you do." He drove back to Dellwood that afternoon through the flat November light that lay across the Ohio fields without ceremony or drama. He stopped at the grocery store because Iris had sent him a list marked urgent. "Dad, we literally have nothing," that he had learned to treat as roughly 70% accurate. He moved through the aisles with the particular lightness of someone who has spent their attention and come out the other side of it. Iris was at the kitchen table when he got home, doing homework she'd actually been assigned, working with the focused calm she brought to things she'd decided mattered. She looked up when he came through the door. "Well?" she said. It went the way it needed to go. She held his gaze for a moment with her mother's eyes, steady, reading the real version beneath the words. "Did they say your name was actually on the work?" He set the groceries down. He sat across from her. "Yeah," he said. "They said that." Something settled in her face, the specific quiet of someone who has been carrying a question for a long time and can now set it down. "Good," she said. She went back to her homework. He sat there for a while, in no particular hurry, looking at his daughter across the kitchen table. He thought about 5 frames in a gravel lot on a Wednesday morning. He thought about a driver who'd barely made eye contact, and a document that said commercial discard, and a herringbone ridge of steel he'd found with his thumb in the cold November light. Some things survive what's done to them. They just need someone to crouch down, press a hand to the surface, and look long enough to see what's actually there. Outside, the light did what it always did this time of year, unhurried, without ceremony. Exactly right.